Welcome to Talk to Internal Audit, our dedicated Facebook Live series. Today's session is about providing an assurance around climate risk, and I am joined today by Kevin Gould. Kevin has a strong background in internal audit and a recent focus on ESG. He has 25 years of experience as a consultant, advisor, and auditor. Kevin has long held interest in sustainability and a master's in sustainability and environmental management. He's now an independent consultant, as well as being a non-exec director and audit committee chair on several boards. So grab a tea, or in my case, water, and join me as we delve into climate risk assurance and try and find out more about it through our conversations with Kevin. So a bit of an introduction, if I may. I'm Liz Sandwith. I'm the Chief Professional Practices Advisor for the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors. And the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors UK and Ireland is the only professional body dedicated exclusively to training, supporting, and representing internal auditors in the UK and Ireland. We have approximately 10,000 members in all sectors of the economy across all parts of the UK and Ireland. And our members are part of a global network of some 200,000 members in 170 countries, all working to the same international standards and code of ethics. May I also remind you that you can acquire CPE points for these Talk to Internal Audit sessions. So don't forget to log them using our CPE template. Details of how to claim CPE from this live stream can be found in the comments section. So today's topic, climate change risk assurance. The COP26 conference in Glasgow presented an opportunity for the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors to look again at what it could do to help internal audit grapple with the challenges and opportunities presented by climate change. We know this is arguably the most acute challenge facing our planet right now, and it's an issue that is moving fast up the agenda for businesses and governments. As a profession, internal audit cannot afford to be complacent. We know this only too well, having published numerous reports on climate change, which you can find on the policy and research section of our website. And the reports I'm focusing on are organizations' preparedness for climate change, harnessing internal audit against climate change risk, guidance for audit committees and directors, and of course, our Risk in Focus 2022, page 32. There are many compelling reasons why internal audit can lead and excel in this space. Not only do internal auditors have the skills, knowledge, and experience to tackle climate-related risks and opportunities, they also have the helicopter view over and a unique perspective on the organizations they serve. Internal auditors should understand the organization's overarching strategy as well as its composite parts. There has never been a better time for boards, and in particular audit committees, to start a conversation with their internal audit teams about the work they are doing on climate change. Remember, if you like Facebook streams and want to spread the word, and I'm sure you do, be sure to share today's live stream. You can do that by clicking on the share button in the corner of your screen. After all, the more the merrier. If you're just joining us, welcome to our live stream, Talk to Internal Audit. Today's session is about climate change risk assurance and the role of internal audit, with our guest speaker, Kevin Gould, who has a strong background in internal audit and a recent focus on ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And he has 25 years of experience as a consultant, advisor, and auditor. So believe me, he knows what he's talking about. The Institute wants to be sure that audit committee chairs demand that their internal audit functions are fully engaged on this particular topic from all angles. Whether we talk about increased threats to supply chain caused by extreme weather events, or reputational damage caused by greenwashing and ill thought out environmental proclamations, or opportunities related to green investment, internal audit should be a critical friend, trusted advisor, and independent assurer of all of these areas. The Institute has a responsibility to do all we can to encourage and support our members to rise to the challenges. Part of our role and the purpose of this talk to internal audit today is to engage actively with our members and encourage them to address the demands of an increasingly globalized and interconnected world in which complex and multifaceted risks and uncertainties come with the territory. And there is no greater example of this than climate change. Internal audit's primary audience is audit committees, board members, and directors. And they also have a role to play and important questions to ask. And we want you to initiate the discussions around climate change and the accompanying risks. Organizations will face dire consequences if they fail to prepare for the transition to a more sustainable future and the physical consequences of climate change. It's now a question of when rather than if these things happen. There's never been a better time for boards, and in particular audit committees, to start a conversation with their internal audit teams about the work they are doing on climate change. We urged our directors to work in partnership and collaborate with their internal audit functions to ensure they're rising to the challenge. Could internal audit be doing more in this space? For those organizations that haven't yet fully assessed what climate change means for them, we want to inspire audit committees and you as internal audit to start these conversations. So, without further delay, may I introduce my guest for today, Kevin Gould. So Kevin, would you like to start by giving us a little bit of background about you and what got you really interested in climate change?
Thanks, Liz, and hello everybody. I guess my interest really started when I did a master's degree about 20 years ago now in sustainability and environmental management. I mean, clearly I had an interest in that, given that at that time I was working in an internal audit department in a bank, which didn't really have much relevance to the master's degree that I did. But I guess since doing that degree, I've stayed very close to the issue, and it's something that has motivated me and interested me ever since. And as I over the last few years stopped sort of working in a full-time role, I sort of developed this interest in internal audit and what internal audit's role should be in climate change and frankly other sustainability issues as well, and try and promote that and make sure that we use our skills to support our organizations in addressing some of these risks. So that's sort of how I've got to where I've got to now. In many of my roles, I'm a trustee of a well-known environmental organisation, as well as sort of championing these issues on the boards that I sit on. So I spend quite a lot of my work around climate change and sustainability these days.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That's a great start to put some context around some of the thoughts you're going to share with us as we go through to this session today. So do you think that climate change and sustainability should be central to an organization's values, missions, and strategic goals?
I'd like to say yes in all circumstances. I think the world's a difficult place at the moment. The reality for some businesses that they've got some very immediate challenges, particularly with COVID, that they need to deal with. But If you look a little bit further into the future, I think if we have organisations that don't have this at the heart of what they're doing, they're going to be out of touch with society, with the evolving regulatory and legislative framework, with the expectations of the customers and of their employees. So I think it has to become at least consistent with the values, mission and goal and strategic goals, if not central to it, but it certainly has to be consistent.
Thank you. Do you think it's sometimes, is it easier to talk about climate change, being supportive of climate change, than actually doing it? I think people who know me know that I'm a dairy farmer's wife, and some of the challenges that we face are really quite challenging to overcome, but that doesn't mean that our desire to do something isn't there. So is there a balance between desire and reality?
I think there is, and I think there's some good reasons for that. If you think at a corporate level, we tend to plan strategically, in most industries at least, something like 5 years ahead. And when we look at, similarly as internal auditors, we don't tend to think much more than 3 to 5 years ahead. Whereas the physical effects of climate change, although they're starting to happen now, many of them are well beyond that time frame. And Mark Carney coined the tragedy of the horizon, which basically means that you discount the impacts that are so far in the future, and it makes it hard to make strategic calls now. I think this is changing, and I think it's changing because of stakeholders, because of regulation, which is bringing those timeframes forward, because customers, certainly certain types of customer groups, expect us to do it now. Our employees expect us to do it now. So I think, I mean, to get back to your original question, there can be a disconnect there, but there are things we can do to pull it together. And I think one of the things we're really seeing at the moment is collaboration between organisations within an industry, between governments and business, between different types of businesses, and between businesses and multinational UN type organisations. So there's lots of collaborations happening, which I think are converting some of those desires into reality at the moment.
Do you think that the pandemic has been an accelerator for the perception of the importance of climate change, or do you think there's a risk, and I heard somebody talking quite recently on a webinar, that actually potentially some of the challenges, pandemic, supply chain, resources, has sort of kicked climate into the long grass a bit, not for forever, but for the immediacy?
I think a bit of both. As I sort of said a little bit earlier, I think for some organisations, some businesses, particularly small businesses in certain sectors, hospitality would be a good one, the travel industry, which is large and small, you know, the immediate challenges are necessarily going to take over from longer term goals. At the same time, I mean, we heard a lot early on about build back better, and part of that is, you know, being more sustainable as organisations. And when you listen to business leaders, you see a willingness, I think, maybe to to these collaborations I talked about. I think the recognition that we couldn't fight COVID on our own, I think it's been translated into a recognition we can't fight climate change on its own. So I think that there's some parallels being drawn. So it's a bit of both. I think, you know, there are some immediate challenges, which means we've lost focus, but at the same time, I think we've learned quite a lot about how to work together. And I mean, my hope is that that will continue, and well, the economy and society will be better as a result.
I think that's a really valid point, Kevin, and well made. Thank you. Because I think it is about collaboration. As you say, over the last what now, 20 plus months.
Mm.
If we've learned nothing, we've learned that we need to collaborate to tackle the pandemic crisis, climate change coming down the track. Do you think that businesses should take climate change and sustainability a little more seriously, perhaps, than they have done in the past, and invest in projects that will future-proof their products, perhaps, and services?
I mean, I would obviously say yes, but I recognise that I'm sort of coming from a somebody who feels very strongly about this. I mean, to be fair, I am seeing quite a lot of this happening. I mean, one example is one of the things that was agreed at COP26, though not part of the formal conference, was a pact between businesses, I think it was the UN and the US State Department, to develop technology to address some of the most challenging industries. So, for example, cement and aviation, trucking, those sort of things, very difficult, and certainly it can't be done on your own, as I said earlier. But so I am seeing quite a lot of initiatives that are happening. That being one by organisations, between organisations to invest in products. A lot of this is being, I guess, driven by stakeholders. Consumers want something different, and it's not always there. So I think those products are being developed in response to that to some extent, and also in response to regulation. So I think forward-looking businesses will do more. I guess what we've got to watch out for, as you said in your introduction, is the risk of greenwashing. And just because you've got one eco product doesn't mean that everything you do is focused on being more sustainable and fighting climate change.
Thank you, Kevin. Really good point there. So can I just say, if you're joining us, welcome to our live stream, Talk to Internal Audit. Today's session is about climate change risk assurance and the role of internal audit. And our guest speaker is Kevin Gould, who has a strong background in internal audit and a recent focus on ESG. He has 25 years of experience as a consultant, advisor, and auditor, and is sharing his passion and his thoughts with us today in terms of helping us to put climate change where it needs to be on the agenda in our organizations. So, Kevin, building on what you've been saying so far, is scenario planning a requirement for businesses to employ to help them prepare their business for climate-related physical, political risks that may jeopardize the future of their organization?
I mean, there's various different types of scenario planning, from sort of extreme data-driven scenarios to basically brainstorming, which is part of what any organization should do as part of its strategic planning and sort of risk considerations and risk appetite discussions. So yes, I think scenario planning is required. My preference would be that we do some scenario planning around climate, but we actually integrate that within our broader scenario planning, because then you look at the business and the economy and society as a whole, and you're getting a more optimum strategic outcome. But so I think it has a role. There's some very specialist models out there about how you do it in terms of climate. But I don't think you need to do that if you're a small business. It probably isn't appropriate for you, but you should incorporate it into your strategic thinking, particularly if you're looking at long-term investments.
Thank you for that. And building it in, whether we're doing scenario planning, whether we build climate risk or climate change risk and cost into our stress testing of the balance sheet and the numbers moving forward, do you think internal audit has a role to play to support their organizations in this space, perhaps verifying the accuracy of the data that the organization has produced and will use to perhaps make decisions around the environmental impact of its goods and services?
I think, I mean, let me talk about data a bit more generally, if that's okay, Liz. One thing that is widely acknowledged among, I guess, the accountancy profession, among business leaders, investment community who are relying on ESG information that's coming out of businesses is that data quality is not where it needs to be. So I think that impacts in many respects. It impacts in the external reports that are being put out by organizations. Some of those are required and some of those are voluntary, but they're still being used. I think it is true for the models that are being used by organizations to sort of plan for the future. I think it's true for management information relating to environmental and other sustainability related performance in within an organization that's being used by the boards for potentially for decision making, as you just said, Liz. So I think there's a lot of uses for data. Data is quite immature in this area at the moment in most organizations, not all, but most. And I think, that's a core skill of ours, the processes around the definition of data, around aggregation of data, collation and reporting. It is a core responsibility of internal audit, after all, to provide assurance for information that's going to the board. And absolutely, I think it's one of the things, in my mind, one of the short-term benefits that we could really bring to an organisation as internal auditors. And I think that is true in probably the large majority of organisations at the moment.
So are you suggesting then that we have perhaps a role to play in helping increase the accuracy of the data and the maturity of the data that organisations are using to inform the board, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think obviously we have to remain independent. That's our role. But there are things we can do in the advisory space, I think, here. Obviously that depends on your industry and how comfortable you are with that, but also in terms of assurance, whether soft assurance or hard assurance. I was talking to some chief audit executives a few weeks ago, and some of them were suggesting that they should do a piece of work, or they were doing pieces of work that that produced a report but didn't sort of give a full audit report or a full rating, but gave advice effectively through that audit report on how to improve the quality of the data and the processes around the data. I think it's absolutely a really important role for internal audit.
I absolutely agree with you, and just to digress a moment, I don't think it's necessarily true just in the climate change space. I think that often data in organisations is immature, and internal audit has a role to help increase the maturity and the accuracy of data against whatever risk we're looking at as our role and responsibility. I just want to think about something else in terms of how the risks seem to be interweaving with each other. So I was talking to a CAE in the summer, and they were talking about Northern Ireland, and there'd been a bit of a drought there because it hadn't rained for a while, and there was a need. She was saying to me that water had to be tankered across the country to people's homes. So, she had enough water in her home. And she was saying that one of the challenges had been, lack of HGV drivers, lack of the actual tankers that they needed to transport the water, so some supply chain issues, and then of course the climate around the reasons for having to tanker the water about. So are you seeing climate change as becoming a risk that interweaves across risks in organizations?
I think it can. I mean, that's a really good example of where it does. And as there's more physical disruption from climate change, it's likely to have consequences we probably haven't thought of. But it also sort of interacts with the reasons for HGV, like driver shortages, for instance, which are more well, probably COVID and politically related at the moment. So there's certainly going to be an interaction. I think the physical risks will certainly overlap with other things, and supply chain is a really good example of that. Supply chain, after a whole host of climate related events around the world, if you look over the last 10 or 15 years, there have been supply chain shocks, and there are models that you can use to support that. I mean, McKinsey has published quite a lot on this, and it's very useful, I think, in terms of thinking through your supply chain risks, for example. But I mean, one of the challenges with physical risks of climate change is just the lack, not knowing where it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, and what the knock-on impacts are going to be. So that in that respect, yes, I think the transition risks, which are the risks that we're sort of seeing more widely, are probably a little bit more predictable, because they're coming down to sort of regulation, to more legislation, to sort of consumer shifts, or shifts in consumer attitude. And although they're not entirely easy to predict, they're probably more in our comfort zone in terms of predicting them and therefore responding to them.
Okay, thank you for that. Do you think that there is more that organizations should be doing in terms of reducing greenhouse emissions, to move away from harmful or unsustainable manufacturing in terms of processes or materials? And what progress is being made on this? And do you think that progress is fast enough?
That's a very big question.
I do like big questions, Kevin.
I mean, like I said earlier, I think there's a lot of initiatives happening across a lot of different industries. Are they moving fast enough? I mean, clearly for some they're not. Clearly we need to do more, because if you look at the data that came out after COP26, the commitments that are being made by governments, by industries around the world, are not sufficient to sort of limit climate change to 1.5 degrees above a pre-industrial level. So clearly we need to be doing more. But I see the momentum shifting, and I think the greenwashing debate needs to stay in people's mind. We need to make sure these are real long-term changes. One thing that we're seeing a lot of organizations doing, not just businesses but public sector organizations as well, is making commitments about net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050. There's a role for internal audit to play there. What do they mean? Are they, because the definitions are still not universally accepted, what do they mean? What's included in them? For instance, are there supply chain, which is technically known as scope 3, emissions included in there? Are there plans in place? Is there effective data collection and reporting in place? Is there a process to be transparent throughout the process, not just sort of wait until 2029 and decide, oh, we're not going to make it, we better change the date. So I think there's a real role for internal audit there at a macro level. But yeah, of course, I'd like to see organizations do more in terms of changing what they do. But on the positive side, and to be an optimist, I do see things happening.
And that's got to be positive, isn't it? That change is happening. I think for me, one of the most powerful images in the early days of the pandemic, when we were in lockdown, and I don't know whether you saw it, was a picture of Portsmouth Harbour, and they did a before and after. Before was black. You couldn't see anything. You probably didn't even realize it was water. And then they were saying after, lockdown and everybody not traveling, etc., you could see the water was green and blue, and you could even see some fish. And that was quite powerful in terms of, the difference, because a lot of people say, don't they, that it's too late, the damage is done, we can't fix. Obviously we can fix, and it's possible to. So I think that's a really good message that you have shared there. I think the other thing that I was thinking about in terms of scope 3, which I think, if I'm correct, includes commuting. And I was talking to a head of internal audit of a very large global bank, and they were saying that, what their plans are moving forward is that, instead of going on these one-day trips, so you fly out in the morning for an hour meeting, fly back, what she was saying was that they're going to wrap a number of things around it. So they might go, I don't know, to Singapore for 6 weeks, and they will do audits in Singapore, in Indonesia, in Hong Kong, etc., while they're there, rather than backwards and forwards. So it's not maybe the answer to everything, but there's the beginnings of things happening, aren't there?
I think, that's an example of how to think differently rather than, change completely, but think differently. Clearly something like that also has human implications as well. So, we also need to think holistically about what the best solutions are to things. But, some of the ways of thinking differently are probably how we're going to get to where we need to get to. For example, do we need to own cars, or do we need to be buying transportation services? There's a lot of examples of that. So, for example, Schiphol Airport a few years ago stopped buying light bulbs, and they started renting light services. The average life of the light bulbs went up significantly, and I can't remember the exact numbers. But because the incentives were changed in the way that they thought about it, so that the supplier of the lighting services had much more of an incentive to make long-term bulbs rather than sell a new one every year. That shift in thinking has made a difference, an environmental difference, and it's probably saving a lot of money because it's a lot more efficient as well. So, there's a lot of examples of thinking differently that can make that will help us to get to where we want to, and that's where we need an innovation and innovators.
Yes, yeah, and internal audit perhaps has a role to play there as well, don't they? As an innovator, identifying inefficiencies, perhaps identifying areas where processes and procedures are not complying with the overall purpose, objectives, goals of the organization, to help just bring attention back to a particular area, such as climate change risk, that will help the organization focus on it and, perhaps lift it up in the agenda within the organization.
Yeah, I think understanding the risk is the first step on the journey to finding a better way of doing things, because you understand what the challenge is, and that certainly gives it an injection of impetus to encourage innovation. So yeah, I think if we as internal auditors have that positive role, I think it's got to be a good thing. Yes,
I think you're absolutely right. I think as well it's worth just remembering that, as internal audit, our responsibility is to, look at controls around risk, whatever those risks are. So, climate change, if an organization has identified that as a risk and put controls in place to begin to mitigate that risk, then absolutely there's a role there for internal audit to see whether those controls are effective in mitigating the risk that the organizations have identified. Linked to that, I was minded, and when I did your introduction, I talked about 25 years. I've been an internal auditor a number of years. And I remember when, risk management was first being, thought of seriously in organizations, and when we had data protection, we started looking at that in every single audit we did to help try and generate momentum and interest and focus. Do you think that there's an opportunity for internal audit to start doing that around climate risk? Perhaps not every single audit, but procurement, supply chain, those sort of audits?
I think there is. I think partly depends on the maturity of the organisation. I think there's a role for both those sort of centralised top-down audits, which may be strategic, maybe program management, or some things that are controlled centrally. And I think you need to do that to understand the risk profile. But yeah, absolutely. Why would you do a separate supply chain audit for climate change rather than putting climate change into your supply chain audit? Absolutely. I think that, I mean, for me, that's always the example I use because I think it's the clearest one. So similarly, when you're looking at procurement, when you're looking at contracts, those contracts need, if you're making commitments to others about your environmental performance, then you've got to get those commitments from your suppliers. So that has to be part of the contracting process. So why wouldn't you include it in that audit? So yeah, I think we should be doing a combination of both. And I think it's a bit like culture and data protection things. It tends to evolve over time, and I think it will get embedded over time. But we're probably not there in most organisations yet. It'll probably take quite a long time to get there, I would say.
So do you think then that there is a role for internal audit, if I've understood you correctly, to expect organisations to include, if you're going out to tender for services, for example, to put as one of the essential requirements that any organisation who tenders has to be able to provide perhaps a climate strategy, some targets, KPIs, goals, that sort of thing?
It's increasingly happening. I mean, I think just one note of caution. I think whatever's done needs not to exclude small suppliers. And I think there's a risk if you put too much around that, that it can. But in principle, I think most organisations are going to be required to do it for their suppliers. So, the NHS, for example, which is certainly the biggest employer in the UK, and certainly probably one of the biggest contractors in terms of supply chain, it is going to be delivering a substantial part of its net zero commitment through supply chain. Now, so if you're, and other parts of government are going to be doing the same, as are sort of many large companies. So if you're dealing with any of those organisations, if you're selling to them, you're making commitments to them. You've got to expect those commitments to come from your suppliers as well. It's got to go all the way down the chain. So, I mean, in my mind, you'd be upfront. Let's do it now, and make sure you mitigate the risk that we know is coming, or mitigate. So
I think that's a really valid point, particularly around smaller organisations. I'm the chair of an audit and risk committee for a social housing organisation, and we've been looking at the properties that we own and the requirement to put them to EPCC rating. Yeah. And some of the costs associated with that are really quite huge in terms of getting them there. Less of a problem with new builds, absolutely, because people are already ahead of the game. So I'm just wondering, is that something that we need to bear in mind, that and it goes back to some of the points we were mentioning at the beginning, which is the desire is there, but there may be, reality takes a little longer, and reality can cost money.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a good example of where there's a trade-off between sort of current customers and future customers, for example, which, I mean, I'm also involved in a housing association, so I understand that it's very real. And as an industry, it's going to cost many hundreds of billions to sort this out. And it's going to take many decades. So I think it has to become part of the thinking. We've got to recognise the real trade-offs. I think we do have to start building it in now, because otherwise it'll be too late to start. But this is also another example of where collaboration within a sector is so important. And frankly, it won't happen without that in that sector, just like many others.
Yeah, really good. I think in the housing sector that you mentioned as well, that you're involved in and I'm involved in, I think one of the real positives for me is hopefully the eradication of fuel poverty, which is a real challenge, because we've seen it with the inflation this winter, increased costs of fuel. And I'm already hearing people say, you know, is the food on the table or warmth? You don't always get both in vulnerable communities.
Absolutely, I completely agree.
So, Kevin, coming towards the end of our conversation, which has been really insightful, so thank you ever so much for that. What do you think are governments and regulators' expectations on climate? Are they realistic? And should internal audit be discussing this much more widely? You talked about collaborating a moment ago with colleagues, suppliers, competitors, and trying to understand in the sector that the internal auditors are in, perhaps the geographical location. Some organizations have a global footprint with different challenges. How do we balance all of these spinning plates? And what are the government and our regulators expecting of not just us as internal audit, but our organizations?
I mean, let's start with the government and regulators' expectations. I mean, they're still quite divergent globally. So, you know, we can talk about the UK. And again, I think this, it's very variable by sector. The financial industry, I think regulators' expectations are pretty strong and pretty clear. I think, you know, we talk about social housing. I'm not sure regulators' expectations there are yet very, very clear or very strong. But clearly, building standards or construction standards will take into account climate change. Again, we don't exactly know how. So there's an awful lot of regulation that is evolving and will have an impact on organisations in the next few years. I mean, one of the biggest is going to be mandatory reporting, TCFD reporting, which is coming for most organisations if it's not already here. And there's also going to be an expectation from government, whether that's going to be implemented through legislation, I'm not clear yet, that all companies will have a plan to get to net zero. So, you know, in terms of internal audit, there's a role there in both of those things in terms of assurance of the information and of the processes. Should internal audit be working, or how should internal audit work with colleagues? I think sharing information across the sector within internal audit is really important, or within a sector. You know, and we've seen this happen quite a lot in the financial sector, which has been ahead of the game. I think in terms of climate compared to most organisations. Again, that's a generalisation, and I don't mean any disrespect for those of you who are even further ahead of the game. So collaboration, I think, is important. Sharing ideas is important. Across industries, maybe just as important, because we can all learn from each other. And innovation that's happening in one sector can certainly be applied across. So I think internal auditors working with colleagues, you know, around the internal audit profession, I think, is vitally important. I'm not sure about working with suppliers. I mean, I think that's probably somebody else's job, but I think internal audit certainly should be encouraging that collaboration to the extent that it can within its remit, and that it would be sort of realistic to do in terms of the risk profile of the organisation.
Thank you for that. One thing before we conclude that I forgot to ask, and I meant to ask before, and I'm sure people on the call are saying, what is the definition of greenwashing?
Greenwashing is, I guess, the impression that you're making that you're green, I suppose, is the obvious thing, that you're very strong in terms of the way you're dealing with climate change or other environmental issues, but actually the talk is more than the reality. I'm not sure if there's a more formal definition of that, but it's certainly something that's been talked about in the investment industry quite a lot. The investment industry obviously relies on ESG data, which includes climate data. at the moment, I guess there's a lot of different ratings processes used by different organisations, both internally and externally. So because of that confusion, I think the regulators are concerned that that information is basically ticking boxes rather than making a real difference. I'm sure that's partly true. I think it's partly unfair. But while there's that uncertainty and there's that lack of transparency, there's that lack of trust, and we need trust in any information to be able to be able to rely on it and make decisions based on it. So while there's widespread concern about greenwashing, then I think it's quite hard to move forward in terms of trusting the information that's coming out of organisations.
Thank you ever so much for that, Kevin, and thank you for that overview of what greenwashing is about. So if you're just joining us, welcome to our live stream, Talk to Internal Audit. Today's session was all about climate change risk assurance and the role of internal audit. And our guest speaker was Kevin Gould, who has a strong background in internal audit and a recent focus on ESG, and has 25 years experience as a consultant, advisor, and auditor. May I say a huge thank you to Kevin for joining me today and sharing his thoughts with us. Lots for all of us to reflect on and perhaps share with our internal audit colleagues. You'll see in the comments box links to the 3 reports I mentioned to you: Risk in Focus 2022, organizations' preparedness for climate change, and the one that we drafted and created for our audit committee and directors, harnessing internal audit against climate change risk. I would ask you to have a look at those reports. They're not particularly long, and they're certainly worth a read, and especially if you've been asked to do some work in this space. So may I remind you that the live stream is available afterwards for those of your friends, colleagues, family who may have missed the live version on the Institute's Facebook channel. I'd ask you also to follow all of the exciting things the Institute is doing on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. The November-December edition of Audit and Risk magazine is available to members on our website, and the January-February edition will be launching very soon. Our flagship internal audit conference that we held at the beginning of November demonstrated how we can blend traditional and new ways of providing support to ever more members simultaneously. If you recall, it was a hybrid conference with a number of people, significant proportion of the attendees accessing it like this, virtually from their own home. Good for the climate change agenda. The conference also enabled us to further develop the sense of community, which has proved important to many people in the past year. And we hope this will encourage more members to share their experiences and their concerns to benefit us all in the future. The years ahead may be tough, but they should be exciting. So brace yourself for a bumpy but exhilarating ride. Highlights in the November-December magazine included climate change, what audit committees need to know. The Audit and Risk Awards nominations are open. The closing date for the nomination is the 16th of February. So please have a look at our website, and I'm sure there are some brilliant internal audit teams that are out there and just waiting to submit their nomination. We also have 2 Judges Awards this year for outstanding contribution in terms of climate change risk and outstanding contribution in relation to diversity and inclusion. There's also an article in the magazine around the future of internal audit and also supporting new business ventures. In case you haven't already checked it out, the Institute now has a brand new community hub for all of you to get involved in. a new gateway to all community-focused activities and endeavours, including our virtual forums, regional network and volunteering opportunities. There you'll find a list of all our special interest groups. So if there are any that pique your interest, reach out. Or if you think we're missing one, then contact me. I'd be glad to hear from you. Our community hub is open to all, members and non-members. So watch that space as it continues to take shape over the coming months. We also have a training course covering the topics that we've been talking about today. So if you want to stay ahead of the game and hear more about ESG, environmental, social and governance, to better meet your stakeholders' current and future assurance needs, then we have our Risk in Focus report that looked at climate change and environmental sustainability as being one of the top 5 risks. In the space of 2 years, this topic has gone from perhaps just being a talking point over a coffee to a principal item on risk maps and corporate risk registers. The course will show you where you can begin to provide effective professional internal audit assurance on these critical subjects, enabling you to deliver well-received engagements that deliver the insight your board and audit committee is looking for. As we move forward into the future, please don't forget to look out for Talk to Internal Audit. All of our live streams to date can be found on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't yet watched any, be sure to subscribe. A link to our YouTube channel can be found in the comments section. We will continue to share with you our thoughts regarding specific challenges, along with input from colleagues, members and guests. So please stay in touch. If you have any specific topics you would like us to cover, please share your thoughts in the comments box. I'm always happy to take questions via email at liz.sandwith@iia.org.uk. Remember, talk to Internal Audit because the Institute is listening. Thank you. Stay safe in these very challenging times. Have a wonderful festive break, and we'll see you in the new year with lots of new and exciting topics. Thank you.